The history of humanity is often marked by moments of incredible cruelty, prejudice, and injustice. So, from an exhibition of dehumanization to a chilling massacre, here are 20 eerie and brutal photos that capture the dark side of history. Number 1. Human zoos.
Live human beings were put on display. These were human.
In 1904, the United States hosted the St. Louis World's Fair, an event meant to celebrate technological advancements and showcase the culture of nations under American influence. However, this exposition also featured something far more sinister: human zoos. The U.S. government brought over 1,300 indigenous Filipinos from various tribes, including the EERIE, to be displayed as exhibits. These people were treated as living displays, meant to satisfy the curiosity of fairgoers. They were housed in recreated villages and were forced to perform daily tasks, such as cooking or rituals, for the entertainment of visitors. One of the most tragic examples from this period is the story of the Filipino zoo girl displayed at the Coney Island Zoo the same year. She was placed among monkeys and lizards as part of an exhibit meant to showcase the new American possessions in the Philippines. Bound by ropes, she became a mere attraction for visitors who would throw peanuts at her as if she were an animal. This shocking display of inhumanity revealed the deep-seated racism and imperialistic mindset of the era, where people from colonized nations were dehumanized and reduced to mere curiosities for the Western world. The treatment of these Filipinos was not only degrading, but also a clear violation of their basic human rights. They were torn from their homes, put on display like animals, and subjected to the mocking gaze of onlookers who saw them as nothing more than primitive beings. Number 2. The dog tags of 58,307 U.S. soldiers.
Just don't stand a chance. You think this little shitbird's in here or what? Just keep looking. All right. Gary,
War is often a time of unimaginable loss and suffering, and the Vietnam War was no exception. It claimed the lives of 58,307 U.S. soldiers, each of whom left behind families, friends, and communities who would never be the same. To commemorate these fallen soldiers, a haunting display was created at the Harold Washington Library Center in Chicago. The exhibit featured dog tags of every single one of these soldiers, arranged in a way that was both solemn and chilling. The dog tags, small metal pieces engraved with the soldiers' names, service numbers, and blood types, hung from the ceiling in long rows. Each tag represented a life cut short, a young person who went off to war and never returned. The number of tags created an overwhelming visual impact, driving home the immense scale of the loss. Visitors to the exhibit were confronted by the stark reality of war and the human cost of conflict. Number 3. Otto Frank revisiting the attic. The Holocaust was one of the darkest chapters in human history, and the story of Anne Frank is one of its most enduring symbols. Anne, a young Jewish girl and her family, hid from the Nazis in a secret attic in Amsterdam for 2 years before they were betrayed and sent to concentration camps. Anne's father, Otto Frank, was the only member of the family to survive the war. In 1960, Otto returned to the attic where they had hidden, a place filled with memories of both hope and despair. The photograph of Otto Frank standing in the attic is a haunting image, capturing the immense sorrow and loss he must have felt. The room, once filled with the sounds of a young girl's laughter and the quiet whispers of a family trying to remain unseen, was now empty. The walls that had once proven a fragile sense of security were now a reminder of the horrors that had befallen his loved ones. Photographer Arnold Newman, who captured the image, later recalled the profound sadness of the moment. As the bells of the nearby Western church rang, Otto Frank was reminded of the same bells Anne had written about in her diary. Overcome with emotion, he broke down in tears, a moment of overwhelming grief that Newman also shared. The attic had been a place of refuge for the Frank family, but it also became a symbol of the unimaginable fear and uncertainty they faced every day. Number 4. The War in Ukraine.
Just 30 miles from the Russian border, on the outskirts of...
War is a tragedy that affects not only the soldiers who fight, but also the civilians who are caught in the crossfire. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine is a stark example of the devastating impact war can have on ordinary people. Since the conflict began in 2014, thousands of lives have been lost, and millions have been displaced from their homes. The war has left a trail of destruction in its wake, with entire communities torn apart and the fabric of society unraveling. The war in Ukraine began as a political conflict, but quickly escalated into a full-scale war with devastating consequences for the civilian population. Cities and towns that were once bustling with life have been reduced to rubble, and the people who lived there have been forced to flee or face unimaginable hardship. The war has created a humanitarian crisis, with millions of people in need of food, shelter, and medical care. The impact of the war on civilians has been profound. Families have been torn apart, homes have been destroyed, and lives have been lost. The psychological toll of the conflict is also immense, with many people suffering from trauma and anxiety as they struggle to cope with the violence and uncertainty that has become a part of their daily lives. But this next image froze a moment where innocence and hatred met, and the tension of the scene tells a story words can't capture. Number 5. A Meetup. The incident that took place in Gainesville, Georgia in 1992 is a powerful moment that captured two people from different worlds. A Ku Klux Klan child and a black state trooper met each other during a Klan rally protest. The child, who was dressed in full Klan robes, reached out to touch the shield of the trooper. The trooper calmly stood his ground while looking down at the child. The photo that was taken shows the trooper in his full uniform with a helmet and visor. He had no visible reaction to the child's touch. The Klan rally in Gainesville attracted both members of the Ku Klux Klan and protesters who opposed their beliefs. Number 6. Ottoman Empire. In 1915, the world was engulfed in war. Amidst this chaos, a darker and more brutal chapter was unfolding in the Ottoman Empire. This was the time of the Armenian Genocide, a period marked by unimaginable suffering and loss. Armenians, an ethnic minority within the Ottoman Empire, faced systemic extermination. The Turkish Ottomans were determined to erase them from their lands, but amidst this horror, some Armenians resisted. They did not have the luxury of organized armies or sophisticated weapons. Instead, they formed counter-militias, groups of men and women who fought back against the forces trying to wipe them out. These militias were often poorly armed and outnumbered. They relied on guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and retreating into the mountains or forests. Their resolve was unshakable because they were fighting for their very survival. In one of the most notable instances, these militias fought in the mountains of Mustadagh for weeks. They had held off the Ottoman forces despite being vastly outnumbered. Their stand became a symbol of resistance for Armenians and for others who were oppressed. Eventually, the surviving fighters and civilians were rescued by French naval forces. They were taken to safety, but the scars of their ordeal would remain with them forever. In 1890, far away from the battlefields of war, another kind of suffering was taking place. Number 7. A patient or a ghost.
And lifted up to his lips.
This was in a mental institution in Germany, where treatments for mental illness were as cruel as they were misguided. The photograph from this time shows a woman, a patient in one of these institutions, forced into a crucifixion pose. She stands facing a wall, her arms outstretched, held in place by straps or ropes. This was not an isolated case, but rather a common practice in the treatment of mental illness during this period. The woman in the photograph was subjected to this treatment as part of what was considered a therapeutic regime. The idea behind such treatments was to discipline and control the patients, who were often seen as less than human. The methods used were brutal and dehumanizing. Patients were restrained, isolated, and subjected to various forms of physical and psychological abuse. This woman's forced crucifixion was meant to break her spirit, to make her more compliant, but instead of curing her, it likely deepened her suffering. Not all suffering is physical, and not all battles are fought on the front lines. In this undated photograph, a Croatian soldier stands in front of a wall covered with graffiti. Number 8. Hopeless Soldier. The words scrawled across the wall are haunting. God, if I die young, send me to heaven. In hell I have already been. These words capture the despair and hopelessness felt by those who have seen too much, who have been through too much. Number 9. Antietam War.
Better edge to open.
In 1862, the United States was in the midst of its own civil war. The Battle of Antietam was one of the bloodiest days in American history. The aftermath of the battle was captured by photographer Alexander Gardner, who took a series of images that showed the true cost of war. These images, known as the Dread of Antietam, shows the bodies of soldiers lying scattered across the battlefield. The scene is one of devastation, with the dead left where they fell, their bodies a stark reminder of the violence that had taken place. Gardner's photograph was one of the first to show the American public the realities of war. Before this, people had only heard about battles from newspapers or letters, but Gardner's images brought the horror into their homes, forcing them to confront the death and destruction that was happening on their soil. The Dead of Antietam was not just a photograph. It was a statement, a powerful indictment of the war that was tearing the country apart. The soldiers in the photograph are nameless, their identities lost in the chaos of battle. In 1865, just a few years after the Battle of Antietam, the United States was rocked by another tragedy. Number 10. Lewis Powell. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Booth did not act alone. He was part of a larger conspiracy, one that included a man named Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell was tasked with killing Secretary of State William Seward, a key member of Lincoln's cabinet. But unlike Booth, Powell's assassination attempt failed. He was captured and brought to trial along with the other conspirators. A photograph of Powell, taken shortly after his arrest, shows him bruised and defiant. His mugshot captures a man who is unrepentant, who believes in the righteousness of his cause. Powell's face is swollen, likely from the struggle that led to his capture, but his eyes are clear and determined. He does not look like a man who regrets his actions. Instead, he seems ready to face whatever comes next, confident in the belief that he did what was necessary. Now, before we continue, just make sure to give this video a thumbs up and also smash that subscribe button while you're down there. Number 11. Crimean War. The Crimean War was one of the first major conflicts captured through the lens of a camera, making it a significant event in the history of photography. The war took place over 1853 to 1856 and involved the British Empire, the French Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Sardinia fighting against the Russian Empire. Roger Fenton, a pioneering photographer, was sent to document the war in 1855. Fenton was commissioned by the British government to capture images that would boost public support for the war. At the time, photography was still in its infancy. Cameras were bulky and difficult to use. The process of developing photographs was also complicated and required a portable darkroom, which Fenton carried with him. One of the most famous photographs taken by Fenton during the Crimean War is titled "The Valley of the Shadow of Death." This photograph is considered one of the earliest examples of war in photography, and it has been the subject of much discussion and analysis. Some scholars believe that Fenton may have staged the scene by moving the cannonballs to create a more dramatic effect. Regardless of whether the scene was staged, the photograph remains a powerful representation of desolation and destruction caused by war. Fenton's work marked a turning point in the way wars were documented and understood by the public. Before photography, wars were often depicted through paintings and written accounts, which could be romanticized or influenced by the artist's perspective. Number 12. Lynching African Americans. In the early 1900s, the United States was a country deeply divided by race. African Americans, particularly in the southern states, were subjected to widespread discrimination and violence. One of the most brutal forms of racial violence during this period was lynching. Lynching was a form of vigilante justice, where mobs take the law into their own hands and publicly execute individuals, often African Americans, without trial. These lynchings were often carried out in front of large crowds, and photographs were sometimes taken to document the events. These disturbing images show the brutal reality of racial violence during this period, with crowds of white men, women, and children gathered to witness these executions. The victims were often hanged from trees, burned alive, or tortured in horrific ways. The photographs show the racial hatred that existed in the United States at the time. Lynching was not only a form of racial violence, but also a tool of social control. It was used to terrorize African Americans and to reinforce the idea of white supremacy. In recent years, there's been a growing movement to confront the history of lynching in the United States. The Equal Justice Initiative, a non-profit organization, has documented thousands of lynchings that took place between 1877 and 1950. The organization has also established the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which is dedicated to the victims of lynching. Number 13. Emmett Till's Open Casket.
The Mississippi community of Greenwood erected a towering statue Friday in honor of Emmett Till.
In August 1955, a 14-year-old African-American boy named Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Mississippi. Till, who was visiting from Chicago, was accused of whistling at a white woman named Carolyn Bryant at a grocery store. A few days later, Till was abducted by Bryant's husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Millam. The two men brutally beat Till, shot him in the head, and threw his body into the Tallahatchie River. When Till's body was found, it was so disfigured that he could only be identified by a ring he was wearing. Till's mother made the decision to have an open casket funeral for her son. She wanted the world to see what had been done to her child. The image of Till's mutilated body, lying in his casket, was published in Jet magazine and other newspapers, shocking the nation and the world. The photograph of Emmett Till's open casket became one of the most iconic images of the civil rights movement and a powerful symbol of the brutality of racism in the United States. The murder of Emmett Till and the subsequent trial of his killers had a profound impact on the civil rights movement. Despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt, Bryant and Millam were acquitted by an all-white jury after a brief deliberation. The verdict sparked outrage across the country and highlighted the deep-seated racism that existed in the American legal system. In recent years, there has been a renewed interest in Till's case, with documentaries, books, and films exploring his life and the impact of his death. In 2007, the FBI reopened the investigation into Till's murder, but no new charges were brought against those involved. In 2018, a historical marker dedicated to Till was found riddled with bullet holes, a chilling reminder of the ongoing fight against racism in the United States. The decision by Mamie Till Mobley to have an open casket funeral for her son was an act of extraordinary courage. Number 14. Ruth Snyder. The execution of Ruth Snyder in 1928 marked one of the most notorious moments in American criminal history. Snyder, a housewife from New York, was convicted of murdering her husband, Albert Snyder, with the help of her lover, Henry Judd Gray. The crime itself was sensationalized in the media, and Snyder's trial became a national spectacle. The public followed every detail of the case closely, and this was one of the earliest instances where a woman was at the center of such a brutal crime. Her involvement shocked many, but it was the aftermath that left an even more lasting impression. On the day of her execution, Ruth Snyder was led to the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. She became the first woman to be executed in New York in the 20th century. As she was being prepared for the electric chair, her final moments were documented by a journalist named Tom Howard. Howard had been sent to cover the execution by the Chicago Tribune, but he managed to capture the moment in a way that would change journalism forever. Using a hidden camera strapped to his ankle, he snapped a photograph of Ruth Snyder at the exact moment the electric current ran through her body. The photograph was published the next day on the front page of the New York Daily News, and it quickly became one of the most famous images in the history of American journalism. But what about a place where death was displayed like art, where crowds gathered not for theater, but for tragedy? Number 15. Che Guevara.
I didn't say exactly that I expected to forget this. You ask a solution.
The death of Che Guevara in 1967 was another moment that was immortalized in a photograph. Guevara, a revolutionary leader from Argentina, played a key role in the Cuban Revolution alongside Fidel Castro. After the revolution succeeded, Guevara continued his efforts to spread socialist revolutions across Latin America. But in 1967, while leading a guerrilla movement in Bolivia, he was captured by the Bolivian military with the help of the CIA. After his capture, Guevara was executed, but his death did not mark the end of his influence. A photograph of his lifeless body, taken shortly after his execution, became one of the most famous images of the 20th century. In the photo, Guevara is seen lying on a stretcher with his eyes open and a serene expression on his face. The image has often been compared to religious depictions of Christ, and it helped to cement Guevara's status as a martyr and a symbol of revolutionary ideals. The photograph of Guevara's dead body became a powerful propaganda tool for those who supported his cause. Number 16. Cambodian Genocide. The Cambodian Genocide, which took place between 1975 and 1979, left behind some of the most haunting images of human suffering. Under the rule of the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, an estimated 1.7 million people were killed through a combination of mass executions, forced labor, and starvation. The Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, also known as S21, was one of the most infamous sites of torture and execution during the genocide. Thousands of black and white photographs were taken of prisoners at S21 before they were tortured and killed. These images, which are now displayed at the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, show the faces of men, women, and children who were about to meet a horrific fate. The photographs were taken by the Khmer Rouge as part of their meticulous record-keeping, but they have become a chilling reminder of the atrocities committed during the genocide. Each photograph captures the fear and hopelessness in the eyes of the prisoners. Some stare directly into the camera, while others look away, their expressions filled with terror. The images are haunting, but they also serve as a powerful example of the human cost of political extremism. The Cambodian genocide remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, and the photographs taken at S21 continue to bear witness to the horrors that occurred during that time. Number 17. Cottingley Fairies. The Cottingley Fairies incident began in 1917 in a small village in England. Two young girls, Elise Wright and Frances Griffiths, took photographs that seemed to show real fairies dancing in the woods. These photos were considered genuine by many people at the time. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the famous author of Sherlock Holmes, was a firm believer in these photos and even wrote about them in an article. The pictures showed the girls with tiny winged creatures that appeared to be fairies. They were delicate and magical, giving the impression of an innocent discovery of a hidden world. The idea that fairies could exist and that these girls had captured them on film created a sense of wonder in many people. The innocence of two young girls made the photos seem believable. They claimed that they had seen fairies near a stream, so they borrowed a camera to capture the magical creatures. When they developed the photos, just as they had described, this seemed like proof that another world existed alongside ours, filled with magical beings that only children could see. But the truth behind the photos was different. Years later, Elise and Frances admitted that the fairies were paper cutouts that they had created. They used hatpins to make them stand up and posed with the cutouts to take pictures. They did not expect anyone to believe the pictures were real, but to their surprise, many did. Even when experts examined the photos and found no signs of tampering, they were still fooled. This incident shows how the power of belief can sometimes cloud judgment. The Cottingley Fairies photos can now be seen as an example of how easy it can be to deceive people, even with something as innocent as a child's imagination. Number 18. Paris Morgue. In the late 1800s, Paris was a city that had a fascination with death. This was shown in the Paris Morgue, where identified bodies were put on display for the public to see. The morgue was located near the Notre Dame Cathedral, and people would come from all over to view the bodies. These were often the victims of violence or suicide, and their photos were taken and circulated. The idea was that someone might recognize the dead and come forward to identify them. But for many people, viewing these bodies became a form of entertainment. They would gather in large crowds to see the latest body put on display, as if they were attending a theater show. The photos of the bodies in the Paris morgue are chilling. The dead are shown in various states of decay. Some of them have clearly suffered violent deaths. These images showed the harsh realities of life and death in 19th century Paris. The morgue was a place where the poor and the anonymous ended up, and their deaths were forgotten by society. But in the morgue, they were put on display for everyone to see. The photos that were taken there serve as a reminder of the brutality of life during this time period. The morgue also attracted a wide range of people. Some were there to try and identify a missing loved one, but others were simply curious. The morgue became a popular destination for tourists who wanted to see the grim spectacle for themselves. The photos that were taken in the morgue were often sold as souvenirs, allowing people to take a piece of this morbid fascination home with them. The photos taken after the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 show a scene of devastation. The massacre marked the end of the Indian Wars, and it was a tragic event that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Lakota Sioux men, women, and children. The photos show their frozen bodies lying on the ground, covered in snow. Number 19. The execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu. The execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu in 1989 was a moment that marked the end of an era in Romania. The photo that was taken during their execution captures their final moments before they were shot by a firing squad. The Ceausescus had been the leaders of Romania for over 2 decades, and their regime was known for its brutality and repression. But in 1989, during the Romanian Revolution, they were overthrown by the people. After a brief trial, they were sentenced to death, and the image of their execution was broadcast around the world. The photo shows Nicolae and Elena standing side by side, moments before they were shot. There is a sense of tension in the image. as they are surrounded by soldiers with guns pointed at them. But this last tragedy reveals a chilling scene that will leave you questioning everything. Number 20. Wounded Knee Massacre. The Wounded Knee Massacre occurred on December 29, 1890, and was one of the darkest moments in American history. Hundreds of Lakota Sioux men, women, and children were killed when the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry opened fire at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The massacre took place during a tense period, and the Native Americans were seeking to preserve their traditions and lands. Tensions were high, and things escalated quickly, as soldiers tried to disarm the Lakota people. Photos taken after the massacre capture the tragic aftermath. The images saw the frozen bodies of Lakota Sioux men, women, and children lying on the snow-covered ground. Now, before you leave, make sure to comment down below your thoughts on this, and while you're down there, make sure to hit the subscribe button as well.